Hello, my name's Peter Whitehead, and this is another of the series of talks on art appreciation that I originally gave to the Bromley U3A Art Appreciation Group, and which have been converted to video format so people can see them during lockdown when the group's unable to meet. So the Art Appreciation Group, as the name suggests, is a group of people who are very interested in art, but we're not necessarily that expert on it. So my interest in Lawrence Alma-Tadema was sparked, I suppose it must be about 3 or 4 years ago now. There was an exhibition at Leighton House in London of his works, and a very interesting catalogue. It was called At Home in Antiquity, and Alma-Tadema was not an artist that I was particularly aware of before, but it was a very good introduction to his work, and also particularly kind of the end of the talk, the kind of unexpected influences he's had on other cultural forms. So Alma-Tadema was born in 1836, which puts him contemporary really with Manet and Monet, Cézanne, and in this country he's just slightly younger than Frederick Leighton, whose house was used as the base for the exhibition, and slightly younger than him is J.M. Waterhouse of we'll hear more about him later. He's knighted, as you see there. He's made a member of the Order of Merit when that is first set up. There were 3 artists in 1905 when the Order of Merit was set up who were admitted to the order. Alma-Tadema's one. The other 2 are Holman Hunt and G.F. Watts, perhaps not so well known these days. And there's only one artist currently who's a member of the Order of Merit, and that's David Hockney. So let's look a bit at his biographical details. He's actually Dutch, born Lawrence Alma-Tadema, so Tadema is his surname at this point, in the Netherlands in 1836. He trained at the Royal Academy in Antwerp. He was destined for a career as a lawyer, but at the age of 15 he had a physical and mental collapse due to consumption, TB, and it was thought that he only had a short time to live, so he was allowed instead to concentrate on drawing and painting. The year 1870 comes into this yet again, as it does with so many artists. It's the Franco-Prussian War. Tadema moves to the UK at that point, and in fact stays there, and I've mentioned the Order of Merit previously. I've called him the antithesis of modernism because what he painted were pure romantic works of art. He adopted a very recognisable style. It was very popular with the public. It was not so popular with the critics. So this is a self-portrait by Alma-Tadema. He actually, when he anglicised his name, he turned his surname into Alma-Tadema. One of the reasons was so that it began with an A rather than a T, and he'd be at the beginning of any catalogues of his works, of artworks and exhibitions. He concentrated on history painting considered to be the top of the genres of painting. Originally he painted scenes from the Merovingian period, which is about 450 to 760, the period in continental Europe which follows the collapse of the Roman Empire. We don't seem to know much about that in this country, and Alma-Tadema eventually moved on to paintings set in classical Rome, Greece and Egypt. He was very interested in making sure that his paintings were historically accurate. He had a collection of Roman and Greek artifacts which he would use to populate his paintings. He used the opportunity when he was on honeymoon in Italy of visiting Pompeii, for instance, and seeing the architecture there. And he really focused on the luxury and decadence of the Roman Empire. You have figures which are very languorous, you have marbled interiors, you have Mediterranean exteriors. As I said, he was not highly regarded by the critics. In fact, John Ruskin, the arbiter of taste in the late Victorian period, thought he was the worst living painter. And his reputation really suffered after his death and wasn't really restored until about the 1960s. So this is one of his early works. It predates his arrival in this country, in the UK. The education of the children of Clovis. So Clovis is a king, a Merovingian king. Sitting on the throne there is his wife Clotilda, whose parents had been killed. And what is going on here, it may look like a children's game, but actually they're being taught how to kill people with axes because they're going to exact revenge for the death of their grandparents. But this is more representative of Alma-Tadema's work in this country, a Mediterranean scene. He quite often gives ambiguous titles to his work. The palette that he used in this country brightened considerably. If you think back to the previous painting, that was quite dark, kind of browns and dark reds. He was exposed to the work of the Pre-Raphaelites when he came to this country in 1870, and he adopted some of their techniques, and this brighter pastel palette is one of them. He's made a British denizen in 1873 by Queen Victoria. That's a kind of strange form of citizenship which we don't seem to have these days. And he was knighted in 1899, so he's very much an establishment figure. He'd also been elected to the Royal Academy very soon after his arrival. Another typical Mediterranean scene here. Young ladies looking over, there's a boat. Is it coming into harbour? I think it is. Is that what they're looking for? Again, it's quite mysterious in a way, but you have very beautiful young ladies, you have these pastel colours. You quite often have, with Alma-Tadema as well, this kind of quite condensed frame of reference. The background and the boat are very much subsidiary figures to the women there. The other thing I'll point out is that in this presentation I've added, as I've done with some others, where you might be able to see the works of art. So the title, the date, what type of work of art it is, and where it can be found. As you say, private collection here, you'll see that lots of Alma-Tadema's work is in private collections. Not so much, I would say, about of the paintings I'm showing in this presentation. I would say 80% of them are in private hands. They're not in accessible collections, which I think illustrates that he fell out of favour quite quickly after his death. Roman bath scene. Lots of marble. You've got flowers in the background, you've got drapery around the doors, you've got the clothes that the ladies are or are not wearing. This is all very typical Alma-Tadema. And you've got naked ladies in the foreground. And naked ladies in 1909 might have been considered slightly risque. But if you put them in the classical context, it makes them much more acceptable. And there is a kind of erotic or eroticism about some of the paintings of Alma-Tadema, which made them acceptable to Victorian middle class and nouveau riche tastes. Nowadays we might have more of a problem with this, and I mentioned Waterhouse. A few years ago there was a great deal of concern at Manchester Art Gallery when one of Waterhouse's paintings, which showed a young lady, a nude young lady, was taken out of display. It was considered to be unacceptable. Alma-Tadema just kind of borders on that acceptability line. But the painting of the marble is really what he was famous for and what people wanted. This painting in Birmingham, Phidias is the architect of the Parthenon in Athens, and this is an early work by Alma-Tadema, and it's well researched, because we now know that friezes and statues in the classical world were actually painted like this, and Phidias is showing off the frieze of the Parthenon before the scaffolding comes down to his friends, so they can have a close look at the figures and the frieze. But you know, all that paintwork wears off and we don't see that anymore. But Alma-Tadema knew that this is how the works existed in their original state. You could do other styles though. I quite like this one, 94 degrees in the shade. There's a young man here who, not surprisingly, having been kitted out in a full suit and hat while he's going looking for butterflies, has found it a bit too hot to go chasing around those fields in the background, and so has decided to sit in the shade instead and read his book of butterflies, assuming. And Alma-Tadema was also very much in demand as a portraitist. Paderewski here, at the time, 1891, a world famous pianist, piano soloist, Polish, after the First World War, so after Alma-Tadema's death. He goes on to become the first Prime Minister of an independent Poland, which is how his portrait finds its way to Warsaw. This was one of Alma-Tadema's most successful paintings, and again you've got the ambiguity, an audience at Agrippa's. So what's happening here? Well, we assume that it's Agrippa coming down the steps there. There's a statue of Augustus centre right, and the three ladies at the foot of the stairs are presumably going to petition Agrippa for some sort of support. The point was, in Victorian England, the people who were going to buy works like this understood the classical world. They had been educated as classicists. They had been taught Latin and Greek. They would know exactly who Agrippa is, and they would recognise the statue of Augustus, and this fitted in with their classical background. So the millionaire arms manufacturer, Sir William Armstrong, so not aristocracy, new money, really admired this painting, and he said, oh, I'd like one really just like that. And Alma-Tadema, by all accounts, had a bit of a sense of humour, and he produced this one after the audience. So the ladies have gone away. Agrippa is going back into his house. The scribes are still bowing to him. The tiger-skin rug is in its place. He's just shown the position, what, 10 minutes later, 15 minutes later, after the audience. Armstrong wasn't amused, and at the end of the day he didn't buy any works by Alma-Tadema. That's not what he meant when he said, "I want one just like it." This is one of Alma-Tadema's most famous paintings, the Roses of Hellogobolus. Hellogobolus is one of those psychotic teenage Roman emperors around 200 AD, eventually assassinated by his own Praetorian Guard. But the story goes that he invited friends, contacts, I don't know who they are, to a dinner party, and you see them reclining around low tables, as Romans definitely did to eat. They didn't sit at a table, they reclined on cushions like that. And at the height of the dinner, Hellogobolus releases tons of rose petals to suffocate his guests. Alma-Tadema had rose petals shipped in every day from the south of France for 4 months in order to get the realism of this particular painting. So again, you've got the marble, you've got the costumes, the drapery, you've got the flowers, in this case the deadly rose petals. And to Egypt now. The finding of Moses, so the baby Moses has been found in the bulrushes by the daughter of the Pharaoh. That's a well-known story, by the River Nile. You can see the pyramids in the background, and Pharaoh's daughter is carried along in a litter by Nubian, I presume they are slaves, while she's fanned with ostrich feathers, and the baby is carried in a basket centre frame. The fate of this painting, I think, it's in a private collection, kind of illustrates the decline of Alma-Tadema, because we can look at its purchase history. So in 1904, when it's produced, it netted Alma-Tadema £5,250. That's an enormous amount of money. I think it's over £600,000 in today's money. So that was what one work, I mean it is a relatively big work, but one work could command over £500,000. So he was producing what the public wanted, if not what the critics wanted. But if we then move on to after the First World War, in 1935 you could have picked up this painting for £861. In 1942, admittedly in the middle of the Second World War, it sold for £265, and in 1960 it was sold for £252, and the thought is that most of that was because someone was interested in the frame rather than the painting. So in 1960 you start to see a turnaround. People start to get interested again in Alma-Tadema in the Pre-Raphaelite period, with his links with the Pre-Raphaelites. Is one of these almost forgotten Victorian paintings which come back into favour, really. And in 1995, when that painting is sold, it fetches £1.75 million. And the most recent figure I've got, 2010, it fetched $36 million. So that's quite a range of prices for that particular painting, and as far as I can tell, it's never been in a national collection. It's always been held in private hands. We have a look at the kind of influence that Alma-Tadema had. In the early and late 1870s there was an exhibition of his work in Munich, and in between his work had been exhibited in Vienna, and we'll see some of the interest that that created. From about 1879 he was responsible for creating theatre designs for Sir Henry Irving's company, particularly, as you might expect, for kind of Shakespearean Roman plays like Julius Caesar and Coriolanus. Titus Andronicus, things like that. And then posthumously, he becomes a very great influence on European cinema, and we're going to look at that in a bit of detail later on. So to think of the influence in Vienna, first of all, this was one of the works that was exhibited in Vienna in 1879, I think it was, seen by artists who were starting to develop their style there, and one of them I think was probably the teenage Gustav Klimt, because I think there's a great similarity between that kind of pose and that subject matter. So this is the sculptor in the background is sculpting Venus probably, and the model is posing for that. And Klimt takes that kind of style and 20 or 15 years later produces works like this. So similar pose, similar quite bland expression in Klimt's case, and the colour palette is similar to Alma-Tadema's. And back to work by Alma-Tadema. Now, The Death of the Pharaoh's Firstborn, 1872, very again an early one, but the palette with the blacks, the browns, the golds, the expressionist features of the Pharaoh with his dead son in his arms, I think is very Klimt-like, and what you see in Klimt's paintings 20 and 30 years later. I mentioned the theatre designs. This is a design for a scene from Coriolanus, now to be found in Manchester. It's a set design, and it contains a lot of features which would later work really well in the film industry, which in 1901 is just about to get going. And it works well for one particular type of film, which was very popular at the start of the film industry and went on to be popular later on in the Technicolor era. And so we're going to have a slight diversion, if you like, to look at sword and sandal films. Sword and sandal films are films set in the classical period, normally in Rome. They quite often link with the story of early Christianity, which makes them quite acceptable as serious works of art because of this Christian subtext. So originally they were French and Italian films. That's where the film industry developed before Hollywood came into being. And two major works which inspired films was these two books, Quo Vadis by Sienkiewicz, a Polish writer who actually won the 1895 Nobel Prize for Literature for that particular work. Quo Vadis is a story set in the time of Nero, about the early Christians and particularly about St. Peter and St. Paul in Rome. And the other famous book was General Lew Wallace's historical book Ben-Hur, A Tale of the Christ, the story of a Roman, it becomes Roman, is a Judean prince, I think, who becomes Roman and whose life is intertwined with that of Christ. The book's written in 1880. It apparently was the best-selling book in America at the end of the 19th century, apart from the Bible. Why are films interested? Because these are really epic stories. If you think you've probably seen scenes from Ben-Hur, you've got chariot races, you've got cast of thousands. That type of thing wasn't popular wasn't possible in the theatres, although they made a very good fist of it for Ben-Hur. They actually had chariot races on a stage in a theatre when Ben-Hur was first performed in the theatre. And the genre was resurrected in the 1950s when the film industry was trying to fight off competition from TV, and Technicolor came in. So that's a bit about the sword and sandal films. So what did Alma-Tadema's work have that they were interested in? Well, these are the kind of cinematic elements of Alma-Tadema's work. First of all, his concentration on props. He'd done a lot of work. He collected works of art and vases and things like that. He'd done his homework on archaeology. He'd developed some ideas about Roman costume, which no one knew whether they were right or wrong. We only had written word descriptions. So there's an already established vocabulary in the art world for recognizing the classical world, and Alma-Tadema is one of the key elements of it. The other elements of his paintings, spatiality here, as we'll see later on, you can look through Alma-Tadema's paintings. Quite often there's a background, something's going on in the background, and that works really well both on the stage and in film. His use of marble identified marble as the material in which the classical world was created. I'm not sure that's right. Most houses in Rome in the classical period would have had very little marble. It even then was the fabric of the rich. And you'll see a lot of staircases and curtains in Alma-Tadema's work, and we'll see how the film industry accepted that. And as I said, at the time there's no censorship on films, so they could show semi-nude ladies, and it was legitimised because Alma-Tadema had done the same in his paintings of bathhouses and things like that. So it gave the film industry a certain amount of leeway to show the female form in a way which would not have been acceptable in, say, a modern film. Put it in the classical world and it becomes much more acceptable. So let's just look at some of the elements in Alma-Tadema's paintings that I've just mentioned here. See some examples. This, again, an early one before his move to the UK, a Roman art lover, shows some of those key elements. First of all, the emphasis on the architecture and the internal art. So an art lover here who's seated in his Roman toga is discussing this statue with fellow connoisseurs, or perhaps it's the dealer who's trying to sell it to him. He's in his Roman house with statuary around him with marble columns. At the front of the scene we've got what's known as the impluvium. The impluvium, that pool of water, there actually is rainwater. The Roman houses were open to the sky in the centre, and the rain dropped into this pool called the impluvium. So he's recognised that. But if you look towards the back left of the painting, you've got stairs going up into an outside area. You see more of the architecture of the Roman villa, and you can see the Mediterranean sunlight beating down on the roof of this gentleman's villa. It makes it a very recognisable Roman scene. You take the title of the work away and you'd still recognise it as this is classical Rome. But that's because Alma-Tadema and artists like him have adopted these conventions based on fact, but they're interpreted in a particular way in these pastel shades. And you get a very similar approach to here. The title of the painting is Convalescent, but you've got the stairs leading up away into the background. There's some activity going on in the background. There's statuary, there's a curtain, the columns, you can just see, I think in the left, that is another impluvium, and the water feature, if you like, and the young lady there being tended by presumably servants who are trying to help her recover. But you know, there's lots going on in the painting, and again you see up the stairs into the background with a brighter light. You have this, that's what I mean by spatiality. You have several layers of this painting receding into the distance, and this was what the film industry picked up on. And we're going to look at some examples, some stills from the pre-1950s, from the silent era, and for the post-1950 films, I've taken some screenshots in many cases from DVDs that I own of the films. So here's the first one, the Italian director Guazzoni, 1914. The film is obviously a life of Julius Caesar, and what can you see that derives from the work of Alma-Tadema here? Well, there's the impluvium in the foreground, which the boy is using to sail his boats on. You've got the marble columns. You're looking through into the background where you can see out of the villa, and left and right you've got furniture which is clearly of the period, and just as you go through the two columns, that very recognizable Roman X-framed seat in the background. It all speaks Rome. You don't have to have any other explanation. If you saw this, you would say, I know that is ancient Rome. But what it is a kind of artistic representation of ancient Rome. Quo Vadis was first filmed in 1913, before the First World War. And again, you've got the marble interior, you've got the mosaic floor, you've got the Roman dress, instantly recognisable. You've got the table there and the statuary, all the type of things that you would have found in an Alma-Tadema painting. And then when we come to the 1950s and the Technicolor world arrives, you get a similar use of the motifs from Alma-Tadema's work, but in glorious Technicolor, not in the kind of pastel shades that Alma-Tadema would have used, because what you're trying to do is really hit the public in the eye with the colour. This is what cinema has over television at this time. It can show colour like this. So again, marble, staircase, curtain in the background, the statuary, the lamps. This is all, you know, inspired at the very least by Alma-Tadema. And we've got some more shots from Quo Vadis. Quo Vadis was an incredibly successful film in 1951, with Peter Ustinov playing a deranged Emperor Nero. Here's an impluvium, water being disgorged into it, the marble columns in the background, the hangings, the curtains, all of which recognisable from Alma-Tadema's paintings. He wasn't the only artist who the Dir LeRoy took inspiration from, shall we say, for his scenes in this film. One of the scenes was the Last Supper, and this is how it was portrayed in the film. Recognisably Da Vinci's painting, which everyone asked, well, would you really all be sitting one side of the table? But the background, the three windows in the background, the arrangement of Jesus and the apostles around him. It's almost a direct lift from Da Vinci, but what it does is it gives cinema a frame of reference. As soon as you saw this on the screen, you knew it was the Last Supper. It didn't have to be explained to you. It's a shorthand version of saying, we're now going to a scene of the Last Supper. You put this shot up and everyone says, oh yeah, I know that's the Last Supper, I've seen that before. I've seen reproductions of it, I've seen it on a wall in Milan. And possibly the last great Hollywood epic, Ben-Hur, again uses very much the same vocabulary. You've got the pool of water in the background, you've got the marble columns, you've got the statuary, you've got the costumes, you've got the furniture, all of that, and the Mediterranean colours, I think, that would have been recognisable from Alma-Tadema's work. It's a reminder, this painting, of Alma-Tadema's attachment to rose petals, and this was a scene that was more or less adopted straight into early film. This is a French film, the Roman Orgy, and as you can see, not particularly clearly in the stills from it, that they reproduced the scene. They reproduced the scene of the roses falling to suffocate the guests at the feast or dinner, but in this case they've chosen to describe it as an orgy. So again, it's on the fringes of respectability. I felt you could show an orgy on screen if it was Roman. If it had been an orgy, you know, in 1911, you wouldn't have got away with it. And Alma-Tadema's rose petals reappear here. This is a scene inside the Colosseum with these swags of rose petals. Caracalla and Geta are apparently brothers who ruled as joint emperors until one murdered the other, and I think you can probably guess which one is going to do the murdering in this particular arrangement. But again, it's a recognisable scene of the Colosseum. This is what we would expect the Colosseum to look like, and you don't see much of the Colosseum, but it is clearly the Colosseum. And this is a scene that's picked up later and much more explicitly in Gladiator, a film of about 20 years ago, which was possibly the last of the sword and sandal epics, and certainly a very interesting film. And Ridley Scott, as the director, explicitly acknowledged his debt to Alma-Tadema, and we'll come on to some explicit quotes about that later on. But you can see the Colosseum is covered in rose petals, but interestingly it's black rather than white marble, and we'll explain why it's black later on. So here we have another Alma-Tadema work, and you can see the distance looking through, something's going on in the background where the slave is pulling aside the curtain. It leads you into the painting, the fact that the slave is there opening up this vista to you. There's something going on in the foreground. The frigidarium is part of the Roman baths, as it might suggest. It's the cold room in the Roman baths. Behind is a pool, which presumably the young ladies in the background have been dipping into. But lots of marble, a curtain being pulled back to lead you into the picture, and you know, the slave is keeping out of the way there but pulling open the curtain, and lo and behold you start seeing the same pose, the same attention to detail. This is an Italian film just before the First World War, The Last Days of Pompeii. There's the curtain being pulled back by the slave. He doesn't actually lead us through anywhere at this point, but you can see that there's an influence here. There definitely is an influence. We've seen this painting before. I'm just using it again to emphasize one of the appeals of this genre of filmmaking in the pre-First World War period. In the absence of any film censorship, you legitimised the depiction of scantily clad or nude women. It would have been scandalous for ladies of the Edwardian era when this painting was made, and when the films that we've just looked at were being shot. Ladies were expected to be tightly corseted and covered from neck to toe, except of course if you're in a Roman setting, in which case you have no corsets and you needn't wear very much clothing either. And another bath scene, not quite so explicit this time. It's interesting that in this painting about 25% of it seems to be one marble pillar, but the pillar kind of diverts your attention across the painting to the background, and you start asking a few questions. So is there mixed sex bathing going on here? You've certainly got the ladies in the foreground, but it looked like there were some gentlemen in the background. Are they assisting? It's difficult. In another context, would have been scandalous, but it wasn't. For Alma-Tadema, this is what his public wanted. They wanted this kind of slightly risque approach, which was acceptable because it was classical and not modern. By the 1960s, sexual liberation had taken another turn, and the type of element that is legitimised in these films, this is still from Spartacus in 1960 with Laurence Olivier on the left there, they start getting a bit homoerotic. It legitimises showing men with few clothes on, either in the baths or as gladiators, and you get the muscle-bound hero like Charlton Heston and Kirk Douglas wearing very little, apart from perhaps a coating of oil, as gladiators and slaves, or Charlton Heston's case, as Ben-Hur himself. So there's always a certain amount of freedom that's available, even in the 1960s, when you show the classical world. You can hint at, which I think this still does, a relationship which at the time, certainly in this country, would have been illegal. Let's go back to this painting, The Death of the Firstborn. I've already said that I think this has an influence on Klimt, but the pose of this dead prince, you can see centre painting here, is replicated in film quite early on. So in 1910 you have a film called Exodus, a French film, and you can see the dead Pharaoh's son in the centre of the frame. They are very much in the same pose as in Alma-Tadema's painting. And similarly, this is from the Ten Commandments, directed by Cecil B. DeMille in 1956. Yul Brynner there as the Pharaoh. It's shot from a different angle, but the pose of the dead prince is very much Alma-Tadema. And DeMille acknowledged that he was very influenced by Alma-Tadema. This is Alma-Tadema's imagining of the Colosseum in its heyday. What we see today is slightly a bit of a ruin. Although it's entitled the Colosseum, the interest, I suspect, is in the young ladies peering over the balcony and what they're peering at. But there is the Colosseum in its heyday, and this is picked up by Ridley Scott for Gladiator. There we see the Colosseum in the film Gladiator, more or less reconstructed in the way that Alma-Tadema imagined. Now, gladiatorial combat in the Colosseum is much too good an opportunity to miss for filmmakers. So right from the very start in the first Quo Vadis in 1913, you get gladiators on display, fighting, killing each other, the different types of gladiator. These are all brought into the story. I've not found any paintings by Alma-Tadema of gladiators as such, although he does include the Colosseum. Ditto chariot racing, which is the other thing we associate with these films. This is the first Ben-Hur in 1925, the chariot race. Probably not in the Colosseum, I would say, in the Circus Maximus, and it just screams classical Rome. In 1951, Quo Vadis does the same, but with perhaps slightly more hints to Alma-Tadema. And then in Ben-Hur, interestingly, they slightly subvert the Alma-Tadema model, because this chariot race isn't taking place in Rome, it's taking place in Jerusalem. And we can tell that really because there's not really any marble there. What there is a lot of sandstone. And therefore that puts us in the Middle East, in the desert. It's missing a lot of clues which you would have got from Alma-Tadema. It's classical, but not Rome in this case. This is a painting of 1870 by Alma-Tadema, the Egyptian juggler, and it has an interesting impact. If you look at the costume and the pose of the juggler on the right there, you might be able to spot him in a couple of stills from Gladiator. So he's centre left there, an Egyptian juggler, and he's in the background there on the left in the scene with Derek Jacobi and John Shrapnel in the foreground. He has absolutely no relevance to the plot of Gladiator. He's there purely as an establishing device. So to establish that this is the classical period, you bring in elements from Alma-Tadema's paintings, even though they have no relevance whatsoever to the storyline. Ancient Greece and Rome get mixed up a bit sometimes. This by Alma-Tadema is actually ancient Greece. The Pyrrhic dance is a dance performed by the youths of Sparta as a coming of age ritual. So if you look in the background at the costumes, you can see that it's not quite Roman. There's columns there, but the men have beards. This is not a very Roman attribute, and even though it's a dance rather than a fight, add a tiger, armour, and you can replicate the pose and you get a fight in the Colosseum with Russell Crowe on the right there. And this was a conscious decision. The exhibition at Leighton House in the display and in the catalogue made this absolutely explicit. Arthur Max was the production designer of Gladiator. So they're looking to bring a sense of the decadence of the Roman Empire into the film, and what they looked at was not necessarily the Latin authors of the period, but certain 19th century painters, classical romantics, who depicted an exotic view of Rome as they wished it to be, not as it really was. So their interpretation, which they took into the film Gladiator, they acknowledge comes from these 19th century painters, of which the foremost, I would say, is Alma-Tadema. And they justify it by saying it's a fiction. This is not a historical documentary. It's not archaeology. The villain in the film Gladiator is the Emperor Commodus, who is a nasty piece of work. He is deceitful. He is murderous. He's deranged. Typical kind of Roman emperor of the late period. But what they took from Tadema's paintings, as acknowledged here, is columns, mosaics, incense burners, lamps, and all that kind of thing, which you have seen in many of the paintings we've looked at, but they changed it slightly. They changed the tones, because Commodus is such an evil character. You couldn't have him surrounded by pastel colours, as you would have done possibly in a Tadema painting. You change the marble, the white marble, for dark stones, and then that, as it says here, reflects the dark soul of the emperor. So they called it Black Tadema. Got one or two examples here. So there is the emperor on the right, with his sister, I think it is, but it's a very dark concept. Taken even further once you get into his palace, although the lanterns in the background and the urns would all be recognisable in Alma-Tadema's work. They're very dark. This is the emperor's study, I think, almost invisible in the darkness. And that's him walking alone. If you compare with the kind of interior scenes in Quo Vadis, they've made them extremely dark, but taken a lot of elements from Alma-Tadema. So we're going to look at one final example. We saw the painting of the Finding of Moses. You've got, as I said, Pharaoh's daughter in a litter. You've got the fans, you've got the Nubian slaves, you've got the baby in a basket. And DeMille, when he shows that scene in the Ten Commandments, again, it's very similar. There's Pharaoh's daughter on a litter, Nubian slaves, although they seem to be a bit European in this one. There's the fan in the background, but all in vivid technicolor details rather than the pastels of Alma-Tadema. So that's the end of this talk. I'm going to summarise it by saying I think Alma-Tadema is a good example of a very popular painter in his day in the late Victorian period. A very wealthy man, one accepted by the establishment, one not accepted by the critical establishment, but he by the time he died, he was an extremely wealthy man. He then falls out of favour, and it takes really up until the 1960s before people start to be interested in his painting again. But in the meantime, he's acquired another life as an inspiration for initially European and then Hollywood epics, looking for a vocabulary and a model of what would show to their viewers, to their audiences, that this was a legitimate classical period work in the so-called sword and sandal epics. Well, I hope you enjoyed this talk. There are other talks available on my YouTube channel called Art for Art's Sake, and I've put the link up on the screen there. Please have a look and see if there's anything else that appeals to you, and Also feel free to subscribe to the channel and to comment in any way you wish. But thank you very much for listening today.